Dear colleagues, dear students, I have the great pleasure to welcome you today in Aix-en-Provence for the second session of the International Seminar on Social Media Discourse Analysis for the academic year 2022-2023. You know that the seminar is convened by 3 universities belonging to the Civis Alliance, Aix-Marseille Université, Université Libre de Bruxelles, and Stockholm University, and also by Maison Française d'Oxford. Once again, I would like to thank the Lerma Laboratory, which contributes to the funding of this seminar. I'm very glad to welcome today my colleague, Dr. Bernie Hogan, from the Oxford Internet Institute. I will give you some information about the format of the session. You will first listen to our keynote speaker, and after his paper, you will be able to react and ask him questions. During the Zoom session, I will ask you to mute your microphones during the talk. You could switch them on again if you want to ask questions later on. You will be able to ask questions either by raising your hands if you are here in Aix-en-Provence, or you can also raise your virtual hands if you follow us with Zoom. You can also type your questions in the chat window, of course. Bernie Hogan is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. He's the author or co-author of dozens of peer-reviewed papers on online culture and social networks. His most cited work reframed online self-presentation as an exhibition rather than a performance, and articulated the potential of lowest common denominator self-presentation as pervasive online practice. Bernie is currently the director of Oxford's Master of Science in Social Data Science. His latest book, From Social Science to Data Science, was published last month. In his paper today, Bernie Hogan will focus on the choice of pseudonyms and the creation of identities by social media users. He will especially deal with the philosophical concept of proper name, asserting that a pseudonym is actually a proper name. He will illustrate his talk with examples from Twitter, Facebook, 4chan, Wikipedia, and TikTok. The title of his paper today is Must Everyone Know Who Everyone Else Is? Pseudonyms, Proper Names, and Local Accountability. Bernie, welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you in the audience, and to you on the internet, wherever you may be. I will share my screen, and it's going to be very much when I do this. Should be there. Oh, wonderful. So, one moment. I'm going to. So I don't have the Zoom window on the top. All right, so thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for showing up to this and for listening online. Oh, and hi, I'm Bernie. That's my name, or is it actually my name? It's not really even a philosophical question, or it is to some extent, because, well, maybe my name is actually Bernie Hogan, or rather, Bernard J. Hogan. You wouldn't really see much of this because this is not the name that I use for my academic work. I go by Bernie, which is sometimes referred to as a diminutive or a demonym. It's sort of a shorter, cuter version of a name. We often see those in English with like an E at the end of it. My sister's name is Angela, and often referred to as Angie. But nevertheless, we may ask, is this really my name? And what about other names? Well, I'm known as Nerny, or I had been known as Nerny. In high school, it was I don't know if it was bullying, but it's certainly a name by which others would recognize or understand me. You can find me on Twitter under Blurky, which is a neologism that I have come up with because it's short, it's memorable. It was 6 characters, and Bernie was taken by the time that I joined Twitter, so I needed something. And then for my gaming, I used Alpha Blurky, and then most recently joining and following on Discord, I've actually just used proper likeness because no one knows what that means except for me. And the point there being that I am indeed, like yourselves as well, known by a variety of different names for different contexts. This talk has, and this topic has fascinated me for many years. Much of the work that I have done in this topic will have kind of a U-shaped relationship to the present. A lot of it was done when I first came to Oxford, 2009 to 2012. It was generally a very popular time for discussing this issue, and then it kind of took a little dip there for a while. I took a break on this topic, wrote a different book on data science, helped put our data science program together, and then and now I'm back on it again, which I really like. If you guys don't mind, I am. Oh yeah, you got it. All right, great. So we'll get the door closed for the viewers at home. Oh, I can't Alt-Tab. Right. So I'll trust you for feedback from the audience. I can't necessarily see the chat in case there's any feedback, concerns, or whatever. Similarly, in the audience, if you have any questions, point of information, I don't mind taking those during the talk, but I will I'll wait until at the end of the talk for more involved questions. I am from Canada, and je comprends un peu de français, je parle petit peu, but no, the talk will be in English, en anglais, and I appreciate your accommodations with that. So very briefly, and this is a very lecture-y-like slide. The rest, I hope, we're not going to be so didactic. But a pseudonym is an alternate name for something or for someone. And in culture, we often talk about a real name as a cultural term for the proper name. During the course of this talk, one of my goals is to problematize the notion of a real name, because I believe that the real name, as a concept that is tied to your given name, maybe one might call your public name, is a means of the state imposing itself on people, and that the mere notion that one has a single or unitary name is not necessary, but that it is a tool by which we kind of think of the government or the state as having a sort of dominion over our personhood. And I'll return to that. Later. But the light version of it was to note that even on the previous slide, those were alternate names by which I am known. And so to that end, if you were to see work with that name by Blurky or me gaming and it's Alpha Blurky or something of that nature, that still has a connection to me, a historical or referential connection to me, just as the name Bernie would. A proper name is, for many people, you would think you have a proper name and it's a single name, Gregoire, we might say, that's sort of my Bernie, but actually a proper name in a philosophical way refers to the ability for us to fix a reference. And this is a very interesting approach to this, and this was in the 1970s, in the early 1970s. I think I have another slide on this coming, but on the next one. But nevertheless, the point is that a proper name historicizes an actor or a person. Often I use the term actor for that as one who acts. I don't mean an actor on screen or TV unless I'm specifically referring to that. Generally, when I say an actor, I'll be referring to people who enact their agency in society. So I prefer now, actually as of lunch, I've been wrestling with this for a while, in what we would refer to the real name as, if we're not going to give it that sort of ontological quality. This is real and these are fake. Part of the work of that nature as well is to consider, how do we get beyond the notion of the online world as being suffused with authenticity challenges. This is real news, this is fake news, these are real people, these are fake people. Because I believe that has been an unproductive conversation for the most part. We have done an awful lot to suggest or imply the socio-political consequences of false actors or fake actors, but the actual evidence to suggest that they have changed people's minds, changed votes, is really quite muted. It is not the case, as I believe, that people are wildly changing their political opinions based on the impressions of others who they have no idea who they are and have never met. Yet that would be the vector of assumption if we think that misinformation and these bad actors online are really controlling our political system. I think that's overstated, and I think that that's actually a reaction, if you will, to the concerns that we have about our ability to establish other people's identities. Because we don't know, we assume that it's going to have a consequence, not that it does have a consequence. There's many nyms out there, mononyms, toponyms, eponyms. Eponyms, for those who are unfamiliar, they're very common. This would be like something is eponymous. So for example, Madonna's first album was just called Madonna. So it was an eponymous album in that name, or in that regard. But indeed, today we're talking about pseudonyms. And so first, I said that maybe a proper name or pseudonym can be a proper name. So what is it? Well, proper names are a way to fix reference, as I mentioned. Kripke referred to them as rigid designators. So the idea is that there's something out there, and if I'm referring to the same thing that you are referring to, I'll use Obama here, and Obama is a widely recognized figure who has also a relatively unique name, certainly in American politics, and so it's easy to establish who we're talking about. But in that sense, the point is that what I'm trying to imply is that there is a person that we believe we can establish. That's who I'm talking about. And so the fact that it's been referred to as Obama, Barack Obama, or his demonym, Barry, as he's commonly referred to. The point is that we have this kind of stable reference. We know who that person is. And proper names are really important in culture and philosophy. They help us establish identities because they historicize actors. They say this is a person of history. Now, not history in the old sense, kings and queens, but history in the sense of lived experience. Now, the important thing about a proper name with respect to history is, or that it historicizes an actor, is the fact that we don't need them in order to have a whole bunch of details about the actor. With prior work on the notion of a proper name, we would think that this is a person, he's got his blue vest on and a white shirt, he's red beard. You list all these qualities and go, oh, that's Bernie. That's a Bernie. And then what's happening is that we would use the attributes of the self to describe an actor and say, well, proper names exist because we have ducks, and where we have things that walk and quack like ducks. And so we have to call them ducks. But that old way of thinking is fragile, because what if we have a duck that for whatever reason is unwell, and it doesn't walk, maybe it's got a busted flipper or something. Is it still a duck? Well, yes, of course, it's still a duck. The point is the notion of simply aggregating all these attributes and saying that's a person was fragile. But instead we can say, well, we both know that's a thing. It's quacking, it's hobbling around, whatever. And so we'll say, oh yeah, so that's a duck. And similarly with proper names, it's the same thing. If Obama lost the election in 2012, we wouldn't be able to use the phrase, he's the two-term president from Hawaii. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't know who we're talking about. And so the basis there is that by having a sense of, we know who we're talking about, we are fixing a referent that allows us to think of proper names as creating historical actors, producing that in a way. Now, the reality is that in that sense, one can be known by many names. And so one is not merely known by their public name or perhaps given name. We talk about it as a pranom and a surname, but that's kind of together as the given name. That in the absence of actually, no, I'll just leave it there. Okay. So before I get to the internet, this time around, I wanted the opportunity to introduce a folk practice from my home province in Canada, of Newfoundland. And it's an interesting folk practice and vaguely problematic, I would assert, although it's the problematic nature of it is relatively managed. It's a practice called mummering, and actually its history is ambiguous. It may come from, some think of it as coming from a Germanic history. Some think it coming from Old English. There are histories of, I guess the first recorded example of a mummer in written history was back in the 1200s. The idea there is that a mummer would be someone in a mask. In fact, it's related to the etymology is potentially related to the word mask, but also related to the word whisper. Murmur being to whisper, and a mask being, I believe in Latin, it's like moma or something of that nature. Wherever the practice began, it took on a very considerable life in Newfoundland. When I go home, my parents' house is festooned with little ornaments on the tree of mummers. I have been given a wine cooler, a blanket, a pillow, a tea towel, with mummers on them. I've had some concerns because the likenesses of the mummers in these photos don't necessarily resemble the likenesses of mummers in real life. It's kind of been distilled, if you will. But the important part is that it is a practice, a folk practice that is revered, by which people will, and in Newfoundland, generally what they do is go knocking from door to door. And then when they go to a door, you might have 20 odd people coming to the door. They're all wearing masks and they're deliberately trying to obscure their identity. They go into the house and then if they're allowed in, as they say, mummers allowed in, within there, if you can guess who the person is behind the costume, then they lose. If you cannot guess, then they win and you owe them a drink. And the drink would be, syrup or juice or alcohol or something of that nature. Now, the reality of mummers is that it's not as clear cut as the mythology would suggest. First, the mummers' play became a means by which local actors, I suppose, or performers would be able to criticize the government. And criticize the state. They would enact this play with kings, queens, various lawmakers, and they're sort of very involved plays. And some of that did indeed transfer over to Newfoundland. But more commonly or more regularly now, instead of simply the mummers' play, this would be the mummers' practice. The practice itself is in some ways queer. People are welcome to try to disguise both their gender as well as their height. People will either wear things or kneel or otherwise really go to town on this. You can see some of this in this photo here, which is from a mummers parade that took place in 2011. It's also not the only place where this happens. In Philadelphia, they've been having a mummers parade for over 100 years. The parade itself, while as you can see here, sort of a queerness of cross-gender play, had also had cross-racial play as well for a while, or aka blackface, and that's been actively and assertively banned in a lot of mummers plays or mummers parades. However, it is worth noting that happened awfully late. In fact, in Philadelphia, that only happened in the last 10 years, as I understand it, that blackface has been banned, as is the case in this right here. So indeed, not a universally unambiguous good, but it is a folk practice. It was also a means by which individuals were able to enact a sort of vigilante justice on read through class. Mummers themselves may be poor, maybe working class, and the opportunity during the Christmas holidays to go around in a mask and antagonizing people would allow them the ability to antagonize certain actors who they didn't like, and they couldn't be guessed for this. And this would be done within the cover of mummering. They would have little satchels full of rocks that they would throw at people, for example. So not ideally an unproblematic practice. For what it's worth, these details, including the death of Isaac Mercer in 1860, are not mentioned in the local and sort of folklore retelling of mummers. I had to find these things out myself. My parents, for example, didn't even know that mummering was illegal, that it was banned, and it was banned in 1861, not 1862, as it said on the slide. And people were only allowed to mummer if they could register, but nobody really registered, and so they said, "Okay, well, you're not taking this seriously," so they made it. Thereafter, mummers became considered folk demons to scare children. I've been able to uncover examples of archives of children being told that if you don't behave, the mummers will get you. So this was how mummers were perceived in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were seen as kind of ungoverned and terrifying and problematic. But then there was a symbolic revival of this. In the late 70s in Newfoundland, a leftist drama troupe wanted to revive mummering as a practice and as a way of critiquing the state, and they didn't really get anywhere with it. They had these mummers plays, and they were overdone, and they seemed very much of the artist community in the main city in my province, in St. John's, but not really emergent within folk practices. It only reemerged as a folk practice with the introduction of a song by a band called Simini, and Simini is kind of a portmanteau whereof the two artists, Sim and Bud, so it's Sim and I, and Bud wrote the mummer song. Bud also has, and this is something I also discovered recently, and it's not passed on folklore, he has a master's in folklore, and much of this song was very deliberate retelling of this for himself. So the tradition continues symbolically, but it's rare to hear of mummers spontaneously emerging, and it's rare to think of mummers as having a sort of problematic nature right now. That has been written out of this. But what's happened instead is that now mummers is kind of organized. So before we go on to the internet, let's see if I can just, this is a video right here of the mummer song. Now, unfortunately, the sound, if we hear it, we might get an echo. Christmas is not like it was. So now I can promise you, I've heard this song about a dozen times when I went home to Newfoundland this year. This is seen as a kind of reverence of practice. And what are we revering here? We're revering the capacity for people from the community to obscure their identity as a form of playing with other people in the community, as a way of bringing them all together. This is a very different picture of a mask and of pseudonymity than what I had presented on the previous slide, suggesting that this was also a means by which there was class antagonisms and interpersonal grievances enacted, and that has been scrubbed from this. But nonetheless, that cuts to a particular concern that we still have today about whether pseudonyms are a means of social cohesion and allowing people to either explore aspects of their identity, to learn about themselves, or to signal to a community, or whether it's seen as something that's antagonistic, even potentially revolutionary, and subversive in order to obscure one's identity. So now this is kind of a summary of this. And in smaller contexts, anonymity is a form of bonding. A present stranger was unlikely. Nobody would just show up to a small community. So pseudonymity became a form of play. But in the larger context, I mean larger population context, in the city of St. John's with tens of thousands of people, this was not how mummering was enacted. In that place, the mummers became what one might say is ungoverned. And in that ungoverning, they became perceived as a threat. Someone died, for example. So this is why we couldn't have nice things. Now, today, people internalize the practice, even if they haven't participated actually, I don't even like that line. I'm going to move on to that. Do we see this as well on the internet? In that line in the song, it says, "Things have gone modern, and I suppose that's the cause. Christmas is not what it was." When I first started exploring this work in the late aughts, early teens, we had just seen a shift towards what's been referred to as the real name web. And the real name web is different from what came before it for a number of reasons, but some of those are underappreciated. The obvious reasons that are appreciated are that it's more dynamic, it's more personalized. There's certainly more data involved in the real name web. This is one with Facebook and Twitter, where we would assume that you would put your real name on, or that you would use your real name central for online dating, necessary for commerce, etc. However, with the real name web has become an assumption that the prior one is ungoverned, disorganized, problematic in its own right, that what we need is the real name in order to safeguard ourselves. We see a lot of parallels with the mummering situation here on the internet, not only in terms of the way in which anonymity can be used for support groups or health, but also in the way in which it is deployed strategically as a way to critique and thus as seen as a problem or a nuisance. I think a lot of that for the internet is very well stated vis-a-vis Anonymous in the book Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, and Spy by Biella Coleman, where she explores this and explores hacktivist groups and the tensions surrounding them. For what it's worth, while you see a lot of people holding placards and looking rather menacing, what you're not seeing is they're not assaulting anyone, they're not bombing anyone, they're not hurting ostensibly anyone, but they do indeed look menacing, partially because of the masks and the mask itself, in this case symbolizing not a sort of deliberate playfulness, but of a particular historical period. Now, in order to disentangle this, I tend to go back to Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman is a relatively significant sociologist, or was a relatively significant sociologist. His most famous work would be The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. It's a book from the 50s. I go back to it a lot. It's really fascinating. It's also the subject of my own, I guess, my most successful work, I suppose. The gist of Goffman's dramaturgical self is the idea that everything in life is some sort of performance. It's a stage play. Like we have a front stage where we perform for other people. That's where I reveal things about myself to you selectively in order to foster what I think is a positive impression. I want to tell you stuff to make you like me better. Or maybe if I don't like you, I'll do the opposite. But generally what we do is we try to reveal things about ourselves, which we selectively use in order to foster a specific kind of impression. You don't disclose the same things when you're working, or when you're a student, or when you're in your when you're out with friends and so forth. These become different, what referred to as fronts, or some might call them behavior settings or behavior regions in which we would have a front. Now, this was working pretty well for Goffman back in the 50s. But what had happened then, over the course of the 20th century, is that increasingly life became mediated. And so from Goffman, we see a transition in this discussion. The first one's Erving Goffman talking about the front stage and the backstage. And then we can move on to someone like Joshua Meyrowitz. This book right here, No Sense of Place, is an attempt to reconcile the ideas of Marshall McLuhan and the ideas of Erving Goffman with respect to the television. It's also the beginning of a rather significant concept called the collapsed context. Now, he didn't call it collapsed context in that, but the nature of it is in that book. He would talk about how, I give one very vivid example of a Southern Black preacher who would give very emotive and very charismatic sermons to his congregation, but was also known to be very clear and tame for white audiences. And so then he went on television. And did he behave in a way that was charismatic and drew in his congregation? Or did he behave in a way that was more flat and more underwhelming in order to appease white audiences? So, a Black preacher here. And the answer is that he gave a performance that appeased white audiences, and that his own congregation thus found him, was very unhappy with him afterwards. They're like, you're fake, you were insincere, you were talking to two audiences, you were not the preacher that we remember. We did not like this. This was a problem. This man was caught between two worlds and two sets of social expectations. The television has done this for a variety of circumstances, whereby we now see inside of people's houses. And this would be for generally for dramas, for sitcoms, where in fact, previously, film and photos would generally not be inside people's houses, but out in public. You can even see these today. There's a real penchant for upscaling old video now. You can do really impressive jobs upscaling old video, and you see mostly video of people out on the street, as that's where it was seen to be appropriate. Now, the sort of no sense of place-ness of Meyerowitz was really very one way. It was about how people consume media representations of other people. Thus, the collapsed context issue was seen as relatively local because it was those who were on TV. However, once we get to social media, we no longer have the same means by which we have some people who are broadcasting and others who are consuming that broadcast. Social media has in previous eras been referred to as many to many. So as in we can all broadcast and we can all consume this. So to that, I actually nod to Dana Boyd, who's had some very excellent theorizing about this in the early aughts. And she now manages a major research group at Data and Society. Doesn't publish so much anymore. But in the book, It's Complicated, she talks about how teenagers are wrestling with these challenges of these multiple fronts in the face of mediated technology. And what's the problem with the mediated tech, or the challenge with the mediated technology, is not that there's just multiple different audiences, but that all of those audiences are perceiving someone at the same time. That's referred to as a sort of a collapsed context situation. And to see the transition of that, I don't know if anyone here online or in person has ever seen this cartoon before. It's fascinating. It doesn't really have much of a life anymore, but it's worth noting that of the New Yorker magazine, which has many such cartoons, this one was the most republished in its history, in its, I believe, over 100-year history. It might be 150 years, I'm not sure how long. But indeed, the New Yorker, this cartoon, and reading the history of it, the author didn't think it was very remarkable at the time. It was in 1993 that this was done. And this is one of those places where cartoonists just do a funny cartoon and then, I don't know, try to put some words to it. This was not done with the intention of signaling anonymity, but yet it struck a chord with many people for its absurdism as being a way of saying that we have no idea who is on the other side of the internet. It simultaneously showed the liberatory potential and the concerns of identity on the internet. And these have somewhat dissipated over the next 30 years. In 2015, Kamran Hafiz had done a variant on this. And you can see some fascinating changes. For example, if the screen, little tiny details, the screen is slightly different. It's one of those more flat screens like an iMac or a modern, I guess, monitor. There's a printer there and so forth. But indeed, it's the same dogs and says, remember when on the internet, nobody knew who you were? The second cartoon, of course, didn't take on the same sort of life as the first one, because of course it has too much baggage leading back to the first one, where the first cartoon was used everywhere. And there was a time when you couldn't see a presentation about anonymity and the internet without seeing this, this cartoon. So I'm going to take this in a slightly different place for a little bit than thinking about identity in a cultural way, but rather to think about who is it that's in our network that we are trying to manage. And for that, we can draw upon a variety of sources, but I really like Dunbar's social brain hypothesis. Robin Dunbar is an anthropologist who extrapolated from brain sizes, from chimpanzees, monkeys, etc., what knowing the group size of these primates and extrapolating to the brain size of the neocortex of humans. So, well, these monkeys got brains this size and they have about 40 people in their group, and these have about 15. And we just put the trend line, maybe humans should be about 150. And interestingly, it's a very crude sort of extrapolation of the brain, considering how complex the brain is. But nevertheless, there does appear to be a kind of qualitative gradient. I wouldn't say a hard boundary. It's not like you get, you know, the 151 and then I don't know who you are. I'm gonna have to forget someone if I want to learn your name. But rather, it is around that scale where humans start to think of people in a different way. As you can see here, there's a series of rings representing people of various closeness. And I think the core and intimate, the core group of people are those, a small number of people with whom we discuss important matters. They're people that are really important to us. They might be a spouse or a boyfriend, girlfriend. It might be, you know, your parents, a sibling, or a best friend. But there's not that many of them. There really aren't for most people, because these are. It takes time and it takes a lot of effort in order to forge relationships this strong. Outside of that, decreasing in closeness is what we might call the sympathy group, about 20 to 30 people. These would be active ties, people with whom, if you haven't heard from them in the past month or two, you might be like, yeah, I haven't heard from that person in a while. And then beyond that, what I'm discussing here is the active group, and this is up to 150 people. And he finds anthropological evidence in a variety of societies. When communities get to around 150, 200, they often start getting too large and will fracture. In fact, some communities around the world have even, such as the Amish, have internalized this practice, such that if it does get too big, they do explicitly split these into smaller communities so that each community is of an intelligible size. So it's not too big in order for everyone to know everyone. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't know more than 150 people, but that once we get above that scale, relations stop being so much about mutual regard and overlapping connections and friend of a friend. Oh, you know so-and-so from so-and-so, and they're, you know, your cousin's brother's friend who employed you at the store. And instead being just like, that's a student. That's the person I know from the store. That's that person that always walks down the street at 9 in the morning. And people then become very local in terms of their roles. That's a very important distinction, where people stop being seen as a means by which they're participating in shared cohesion, but instead become kind of just a particular role specialization. You know, like I said, a student, for example, I remember many students, but I remember most of them merely as student and not as student plus friend plus researcher plus so forth. But if you were to look into, say, my network, there are still some students with whom I collaborate, or are no longer students, they're now colleagues, and I collaborate, but that wouldn't be the case for any of them. For the ones that I collaborate, I would have a better sense of who they know among other connections. Now, it is still an open question whether that software in our head, loosely speaking as software, I take metaphorically, whether the means in our minds, might say, suggest 150 of any network or of our network. So for example, can I talk about the network of people who all make a certain kind of music? I know this person makes music with that, and is that located elsewhere? We're still not sure about that, but this is quite robust. Now this kind of goes against, or goes into what I think I'm going to feature here, an old meme. For those who are into memes, this one might be considered dank. It's very old, I suppose, maybe 4 or 5 years. And what makes it a meme is that it's a very reproducible structure by which we can communicate a sentiment. And I like this one because of the way it shows the multiple perspectives upon which people are known. The important thing, of course, is that all of them may be present in a single context. All of them here may be, seeing you on Facebook or Twitter, etc. And of course, this is another example of such memes. This one is more true to my own heart because the lower left-hand corner, I think, is what my publishers think of me, because I have a book that's 6 years in the writing. And so they must think I'm a lower order animal because I haven't finished it. But I did indeed publish my first book there last month. And of course, I think myself as Einstein tier, maybe not, but the point is that these are multiple perspectives. Now, I want to show a little bit of those perspectives using social network analysis with some real data for a little bit. I have a rather colorful set of disciplinary backgrounds, but I think my core is in sociology and in social network analysis. And so I want to bring that briefly to bear on this topic. So in social network analysis, we can think of a thing called an egocentric network. That is a network of the people that you know. So the Dunbar personal network is an egocentric network. We call it an egocentric network because the people are anchored, or there is a focal person called ego. But that's a respondent, that's a person. So we say, who do you know that you're close to? And then they list off these people, and you may see on the left-hand side just alters. Then it gets really interesting, though, when you have data not just on the alters, the other people in the network, but the alter ties. Who is connected to whom in this network? Is this a network of 4 different people who don't know each other? Or is this a network of 4 people who are all connected and can thus interact in my absence or know each other in my absence? This is often called the 1.5 degree network, even though it's not like 0.5, it's just saying it's somewhere in between a 1 degree network of the people I know and a 2 degree network of the people they know. And this network in the middle is quite compelling for a number of reasons. So I had used to collect these networks on Facebook. There was a time when Facebook looked like this, a long time ago, when you were able to access this sort of data from Facebook. Now, a number of people had accessed this data for a variety of different reasons, and this had led to what's described as the Cambridge Analytica scandal, whereby other actors have taken this data and exploited it, or ostensibly exploited it. However, I still maintain that the case is overstated. I have some strong opinions on Cambridge Analytica, but I'll have to park them for now, except to say that I think that it was used as cover. And it was used as cover for Facebook in order to lock down accessibility to the various APIs and technologies that allow people to do things with Facebook data. So right now, for example, if you're on Facebook, it asks for your contact list. You can have access to your address book so I can find your friends. But what it doesn't enable is programmatic access for you to take those friends from Facebook back off. So it wants the data in, but it's not giving it out anymore. But there was a time when it did. And within that time, we were able to see some examples of the ways in which personal networks and identity collide. And there's a pre-modern view of the world we might think of, and this is from Georg Simmel in the Web of Group Affiliations, where in pre-modern society, we might have a family, a clan, and a town. And so people just have a family or an extended family or a set of extended kin ties within a particular geographical region. This is the sort of view of the world from which mummery would proliferate, where we can have that sort of ambiguous identity play. It's also the sort of view, perhaps, loosely speaking, in the internet, of obscure IRC channels or MUDs or MOOs. These are old phenomena where the kind of prehistory of geeks on the internet, they would go there and go into chat rooms or whatever. But you would assume that the only other people in the chat rooms would be computer programmers or data entry people, or they would be very skewed. They'd be skewed demographically. They'd maybe be male, but not necessarily. In fact, on that note, the book by Laurie Kendall, Hanging Out in the Virtual Pub, is perhaps, I think, the best ethnography of this type of space. And within there, Laurie wrestles herself with being an ethnographer in a space, knowing people only as pseudonyms, and herself only being known as a pseudonym. But anyway, those are small local spaces. In a modern world, we have distanciating technologies, and even before the television, Simmel was able to think of the car and the telegraph and letters as being able to create distance between people successfully. So not everyone you know from your hometown will know every one of your neighbors or the people you have as a sports team, or maybe from church, or wherever you find your people. But yet we have thus, regardless of this as our personal network, considered it not in terms of the social contexts from which these people came, but in terms of a kind of technological set of relations, much like what I showed, friends and friends of friends and everyone. But in reality, or Twitter, just everyone, or maybe next year it'll be no one on Twitter. I don't know. They're quite a mess. But here's an example of a network. This is mine. This was my network. This is one of the earliest ones that I've produced. And it can give you some coherence to this sort of stuff. So it's not merely metaphorical. We have here up in the upper right-hand corner, my family. There was a kind of a black square in the middle between the light green blob and the salmon blob. That's my sister. You can see the sense of that as someone who knows both members of my family, but also people that are from high school. And so this has for me a certain coherence. For you, it's probably just dots and lines. But I'm not the only one who was able to do this. I had created a front end with my colleague Josh Melville, and getting other people to visualize their networks. And we're getting back to pseudonyms, don't worry. And so one of my happiest moments was seeing a junior colleague, she was a graduate student, Elizabeth McConnell, who was being mentored by a colleague of mine, put together a paper on this that was just so inspired. They eventually brought me onto the paper, but I'm like third or fourth author. It's Liz's paper. And to some extent, Valant Nevray, who rendered this image right here. They had interviewed 150 odd queer persons in Chicago. Liz was working, and this was done through the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing. So people were brought into the lab, they visualized the network, and they labeled each of these different color blobs. Nobody had problems with that. Nobody was like, I don't understand what this blob meant. The ability for us to sort of get a number of relations, link them together, and cluster them in that way. For some people, it seemed like magic, but with basic network analysis, it just works really well. And so, yeah, this is definitely friends, this is family, and so forth. And I did mention that they were queer persons. We described them as LGBTQ. We had trans persons, bi, gay people, and so forth. For those who do not identify within the queer community, I do, you may misunderstand the process of coming out is not a single process. It is not one where one just rings a bell, I'm gay, and then all of a sudden the town knows. No, coming out is a continual process. I have to do it right now. I mean, I just say, who's this guy talking about the gay stuff? Why is it? And so I'm coming out in front of you. But some people are out to everyone. Some are not out to anyone. Some are out to everyone but their family, and some are only out to their family. So this creates some different conditions of disclosure. Now, this is these people are all young persons. They are all under 30, and I believe they are all of age 16 to 25, but I have to go back and check the paper. So this is a time in their life when things are uncertain, and they are quite worried, or concerned rather, about fostering a positive impression for others. I'm just going to cruise through this one very briefly, but one thing that we do point out is that on Facebook, it was evident that those people who were not out to their family were also having very few connections. As we can see here in the upper left, this blue and this green, oh, you can see that, so great. So, you know, there are many connections between, on average, of the high outness between family and people from school. They knew the same people. But in the low overall outness group, those two groups were kept separate and apart. And that was a deliberate attempt, even though Facebook's logic of connectivity will still continually recommend friends and say, hey, do you know this person? You should add them. Because from Facebook's point of view, certainly at that time, more connectivity equals good. But now this is not necessarily good for people. In addition to the quantitative work, we used some qualitative things. I use this account to manage multiple pages, one of which is for my drag persona. This account has received some negative feedback from the more conservative family and friends. They found the drag show and pictures of it somewhat offensive. So I added them to a limited privacy visibility group to keep them from seeing my raunchier posts. This is a 26-year-old talking about this. And Here's another one talking about their Facebook. I use it for talking to current friends, maintaining a relationship with old friends, and eventually I'll get a separate page for my family to add me on. I just feel bad about having the need to create a second page for simply talking to my family, because many of them do not accept my true well-being, that is, me being happily gay and seeing other people. Embracing and accepting that part of me is so openly upsets them. So this account is the only place I can express myself freely. So this is an account for which the person has kept their lives separate. So now bringing this back to Goffman's metaphor breaks down online due to the separation of the audience and the performer. So I asserted a better metaphor there, or what I thought might be a better metaphor, of a gallery with a curator. Our performances are frozen. It's a photo, it's a piece of text, it's a video, it's a TikTok. I didn't actually put TikTok in the presentation after as it happened. So if you're expecting much from TikTok, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But I mean, just go to TikTok because there's always something funny and obscure there happening. But nevertheless, I asserted that a better metaphor was of a gallery with a curator. And what that does, the curator reminds us of an intermediary in our relations. I do not simply have a relationship with the people I know on Facebook. I have a relationship that's intermediated by Facebook. They decide what shows up first. They decide what shows up second. I can fiddle with the settings, but when you land on Facebook now, you probably cannot guess precisely which friend is going to be at the top, which friend is going to be second, what the order of the content is going to be, because that's not under your control, it's under the control of the curator. So now the curator, in this case, the Facebook algorithm, is having a sort of command over our self-presentation. It creates an uncertainty with who our audience is. Now, I asserted in this paper in 2010 that it would lead to a culture of the lowest common denominator. That can sound a bit snooty, like, oh, it's all just fart jokes or something. That's not what I mean. The lowest common denominator in this sense suggests that people have a perception of their audience. Now, that might not be an accurate perception, but they kind of have a sense of who's on Facebook or who's on Twitter, and a sense that if they say something that violates the lowest common denominator, they will get griefed. In this particular case, back with the lived experience, we have people whose the pressure for a lowest common denominator on Facebook is too great. The lady down here, the Black cisgendered female lesbian, you should find the bottom one, simply cannot reconcile her different selves within the one space, because the lowest common denominator cannot be reconciled both with her queerness and with her family and their lack of acceptance. And this is really common. 10 years ago, when I gave this talk, or a variant on my work of this nature, I wouldn't have given this talk because I wrote this recently, but talk of this nature, I would, if it ought to be titled something along, help, my mom's on Facebook, what do I do? Because back then there was a concern of someone is posting a photo of me at a party and it's going to look really terrible, or you should hide that photo, or I don't want my parents seeing that, or something of this nature. Nowadays, the talk might be help, my children aren't on Facebook and I can't watch them. And what are they doing on that site called Discord or whatever? And so what has happened is that Facebook has created a cultural lowest common denominator that simply is insufficient for the sort of identity and exploration that people want. This leads us to saying, well, where do people actually express themselves and how do they do it? And that led me to an exploration of pseudonyms. So motivations for pseudonyms can be internal, external, or functional, at least according to Hogan, that guy. And I do this in order to disassemble the concern that pseudonyms are solely for problems. Internal motivations are the motivations for people to not be, say, discriminated against or foster an impression that stigmatizes them. We have an example here that's just, I notice there's a lot more women in the room than men, at least as far as people are sort of just visually identifying. You may detect the intense condescension in this right here. This is from Amazing Stories from 100 years ago. That the third prize winner should prove to be a woman was one of the surprises of the contest. For as a rule, women do not make good science fiction writers because of, I don't even want to go. It's just off. When I was here earlier today, I saw in the section of like books for your department. One of them was about George Eliot. And this was explicitly why George Eliot chose that name. Her name was Marianne, but she felt that if she was to publish as Marianne, she would be publishing ladies' stories, and she wanted to publish legitimate literature. She was actually quite critical, not just of men, but of what she thought of as trivial women's stories, and that she essentially, she said she expected more. And so she could not do that without a pseudonym. The internal motivation was to say, I cannot be who I am according to society's expectations without some way to obscure my identity. In the early 21st century, we see this happening again, not just for celebrities and authors who would produce a large work, but as a part of everyday life. Here's an example of from Wikipedia, where there was a discussion about the norms about identities and what names people use. And they say COIN is WPC. Wikipedia have all these little acronyms that they use for how they manage their stuff. But it said, user HOHAN initiated and his comments above that it's wiki legal to track down everything relevant of every professor, student, writer who is foolish enough to edit in their own name and blah, blah, blah. So the point is that someone there is trying to use people's identities against them. And then on Wikipedia, that becomes a problem because they then can't collaborate on the identities together because it's like, well, when 10 years ago you said this, how dare you put this on Wikipedia? And so people then become beholden, not to the work that they're doing, but to their past history. Now, external motivations are slightly different. That's where people don't necessarily want to obscure other people's perceptions of them, but do their thing. This is where they want to adopt a new persona. So Lewis Carroll is a classic example. Charles Dodgson at the time was a logician at Christchurch, Cambridge, or oh, Christchurch, Oxford. That's funny. Yeah. So I mean, Oxford's, there's all kinds of Alice in Wonderland stuff in my town. There's shops and so forth. And we all know it from Lewis Carroll, but that's not his name at all. His name is Charles Dodgson. And it wasn't because he felt a pressure or stigmatization for writing Alice in Wonderland, but because he merely wanted to adopt a new persona. We also see examples of this with drag. We saw a quote of that earlier. And so I use this as an opportunity to mention the absolutely wonderful Divine. And such external motivations, we have on the end, I honestly can't remember his name offhand, but he was referred to as Deep Throat. And he was the person who was a whistleblower who gave lots of information to the people who were investigating Nixon in the US. And for a while, people didn't know who Deep Throat was. I mean, the pseudonym is Velker, but regardless, it was obviously a very necessary thing for him at the time in order to reveal this information in such a way that it would get to the right people and actually identify the gross corruption that was happening in the state. So in these motivations right here, someone's adopting a new persona. Now, there's also functional motivations for students. Although maybe the Deep Throat one, maybe that might be internal, but less important. There's also functional motivations here. And those are the fact that sometimes names are just simply not available. Whether you're on a piece of software that expects names to be a certain length, or whether there's a scarcity of names. In this case, if you were to search for BernieHogan.co.uk, it's not available, or I can get these crappy ones like BernieHogan.tv or something if I wanted a web page, or .vip, I suppose. Even my Twitter here is blurky, as I stated, but not because I wanted a pseudonym. I didn't want to adopt a different persona. Just at Bernie Hogan was just not available. So now, with all that said, now we turn to the question here of why do we think that real names will save us? Where does the notion that a real name is an appropriate name? Now, we repeatedly see this in discourse. Mark Zuckerberg said this very crudely, saying having two identities is an example of a lack of integrity. That was in 2012. Only 3 years later, they were taken to court because they wanted to force people to use all their real names. And a drag queen, Lil Miss Hot Mess of all people, took them to court to say, no, I am known by this name. I'm not known by my given name, or what some might call a proper name. or real name, and then it's not fair for you to try to invoke that name for me because this is the one that I need for my trade. It's like it's how I get my gigs. And indeed, they won. And Facebook had walked back what was a real name policy. Now, of course, Twitter had done a similar thing. And if you see this, what's in a name, the case for inclusivity through anonymity, it argues a lot of the same things that I am saying here in this paper. It may or may not have even been influenced by my work. But then it was in 2021, and then Elon Musk bought Twitter. And surely enough, a year later, he says he wants to authenticate all real humans on Twitter. And you can see from Elon a very similar sort of discourse as from Zuckerberg here. And that discourse is now a totalizing one. So I said, well, perhaps the real trouble is identity confusion. That's, I guess, some remarks on misinformation and the concern that what's not at stake is the presence of pseudonyms or alternate names, but the interface between those who will use names in some obscure way, or fake name or false name, and those who use their real name on the very same platform. In the case of mummers, this was done through ritual. There was a ritualized practice whereby the masked would come into the house and they would have to do the game and so forth. And in the times when that ritualized practice was violated, that's when the state stepped in to say, you can't do this. Whether or not it succeeded was another question. It didn't succeed. But what did succeed was the fact that mummering just became kind of, the communities were no longer able to support it. So here I suggest that eponymity, or having one name, this is the name that stands for yourself, thus is to be fully responsible to the state in all contexts. Doesn't sound like the worst idea, but it does assume that governance is a totalizing force. So what we do is we internalize one's given name as essentialist quality. I'm not just like somebody calls me Bernie, I am Bernie, or you are what name you are. And it becomes a sort of very tightly wedded part of one's psyche, but it's not necessary. And first of all, to assume that a single name would be sufficient to identify the self is also to assume that the government is able to identify the self in all contexts. Now we can see this as well in the UN Declaration or the Convention on the Rights of Children. It's not actually in the Declaration of Human Rights where I thought it was, but it's in this, and it's relevant. For the rights of children, the right here is every child has a right to be registered at birth, to have a name and a nationality, as far as possible to be known and cared for by their parents. Now that right is an important right because a child without a name and that is not registered is not able to access the same sort of support for refugees, for extremely poor persons, destitute. The lack of access to government services and care will severely hamper their life chances. It is important for people to have a means by which they can access such support. However, within this discourse is not every child has a right to access the support via registration. It's every child has the right to a name and therefore get registration. It's a really important difference here. And the difference is that what we have kind of parceled in with this is a notion that the state is the giver and manager of names. So this is a peculiar right in a way that simultaneously assumes a unitary identity and weds identity not only to the family or tribe, but to the nation state as the point of care. It creates identity as a totalizing narrative. So now we talk about a real name. For nowhere is it explicitly stated that the name is a tool of the state. It's just assumed. Yet, depending on the culture you're in, you may have a name that's internal to your group and a name that's external. This is the case, I know for, and I've been looking up a number of these because I had forgotten. Maori will have a name that's internal to the tribe and also a public name. Orthodox Jews will do the same thing as well. They will have a Hebrew name that is for within the synagogue, and then they will have another name for people out in public. That we should have names for different purposes is not internalized or even considered within this. It's assumed that there will be a name and the name is for the state. Now this actually leads to a really interesting tension here between what's referred to as registration and enumeration. And to register is to sign up. It's to give out one's consent. Whereas to enumerate is to count all that's in the boundary. So 5 people there, what's their names? Considered on an interpersonal level, this is the difference between the signals that we give off, let's look in the place and just count all the people, and the signals that we give out, let's ask them what their names are. Thus, this is identity as a form of governmentality. This is identity as a form of projecting the state and the state's power, and the nation state's power over people by assuming that this is not merely a matter of enumeration, but is one that is, we take as self-evident. So interestingly, on this point, I asked ChatGPT on this, and we're near the end here now. But I said, you know, how would we reconcile the notion of governmentality, this Foucaultian idea, with pseudonyms? And it says that governmentality is not just like laws and regulations, but more subtle forms of control, such as the shaping of individuals' thoughts and behaviors through norms and practices. ChatGPT was quite impressive on this, in fact. In the context of online communication, these pseudonyms can thus be seen as a form of resistance to the techniques of governmentality. By using a pseudonym, individuals can create an online identity that is separate from their offline, etc. I think it kind of goes a little off rails on there, but I do appreciate the sentiment or the concept here. The state is not always there for everyone in every way. And people can invoke the state also in ways which is not fair either to the state or to others. When we think of those who have the discursive power, potentially conservative voices saying that they believe that they get to determine the norms, then they can invoke the power of the state in making people feel uncomfortable with either revealing themselves, coming out, and so forth. So that kind of leads us now with a bit of a research agenda for what to do with this. In light of this theorization, here's some claims, wrapping some of this stuff up. So pseudonyms are a viable practice in restricted contexts, where it's obvious that social stigma would otherwise undermine support. Sometimes it's really important. And we see this support thing happen all the time. Online health support forums, I think, are the most salient examples of this, where people generally will not go onto such a forum with their real name because they want to keep that information private. But private in this sense, and I didn't put that in there, but it's just out of the literature. Privacy has evolved towards a notion of what's referred to as contextual integrity, so that it is information that is meant to be within a particular context. Thus, collapsed context is actually a way in which we're literally undermining privacy by undermining the cohesion of contexts. Pseudonyms thus are a way of recovering privacy, recovering local context for one's practices. They're by nature seen as antagonistic to state power, for they undermine the notion that the state governs a universal self-identifier. If I'm to choose a name for myself that's different, then the state has to find a way otherwise to establish. That's not hard. If the CIA or MI6 are listening, they'll know who I am, whether or not the pseudonyms exist. It is not the findability in the case of an investigation or criminal activity which we are concerned about. People have traces which can be, if you have enough resources, you can often find those people. It is the ideology that goes with this, the ideology behind the discourse, the ideology of a unitary identity. That is what I am taking issue with as being enacted by the state. So apart from undermining identity, as a means of signifying the culture, pseudonyms can bond people together, whether it's anonymous, people in a health support forum, mummers, etc. In light of some new means for creating synthetic likenesses, which we can do alongside personae, we can create new faces, new images, and they can be very, very credible these days. We're now very worried about, I say we broadly as a society, I'm not sure the extent to which I'm allowed to invoke that generality, but given that there's been hundreds of papers on detecting deepfakes from a technical point of view, it appears that there's a real considerable concern about whether the things that we see really represent the people we expect them to. Is that really them? Is that really that politician? Is that really my friend that's in that? In this case, state-supported actors will maintain a focus on detecting the deepfake rather than detecting the social problem. the reason by which individuals must avoid social stigma. So this leads to a new research agenda, and I'm keen to see who would like to take this up. So first of all, what scale of human behavior can be supported by pseudonyms? We may think that Reddit is actually, millions of person scale that's sponsored by this, but at the same time, Reddit also is disassembled into smaller subreddits, each of which is moderated by people, and those that are not moderated are out the door, and not everyone is actually talking on these. We might ask, does one's satisfaction with pseudonyms matter based on the variations in identity signals? If I know a lot, does it matter? Does it matter if I have a name that has a bunch of stars next to it and the different, my achievements on video games and all these things? And that's a really, really heavy, it's basically me. It's got all of my, achievements. And so I'm now beholden to that identity, even if it is not my registered legal name. When do we use that versus throwaway accounts where the signals are very poor, there's nothing to them? When does it matter more? When we believe that the state cannot find us, or when our peers cannot find us? So Twitter already has a means to connect people on and offline through cell phones and two-factor authentication. Thus, for Elon to say that we need an authentication real name policy is not so much a signal of what Twitter needs as it is a signal of what he wants to project Twitter to be. And also, under what conditions are pseudonyms simply called local names? When do we not think of them as antagonistic or hostile? When do we just say, oh, well, we always know him as Bud? And that's not really seen as political or is not seen as reactionary. It's just seen as local rather than of the state. So I've had lots of students work on this issue over the years, and not all of it gets integrated. So here's a little handful of hot takes on this. First, one of my earliest students looked at how people who had their accounts on Foursquare, which is where you can check in locally, and Twitter, when they had them linked, they actually shared less personal information than the same people who had two accounts, one on each platform, and didn't link those. I had a student who showed that trouble arose from the misspecification of roles. It wasn't just that there was like family in one group and friends in the other, but it was often that like someone from high school would now enact a new role. They're no longer my mate from high school. They're now the person who's representing another ideology. They're like, hey, I've become, I only drink alkaline water now. How dare you drink that water? You got to drink this water. Like, why are you even talking to me about this? I know you as the basketball player. But because their role has changed, they bring that new role into this space. A colleague, former student, Alex Amari, showed us pseudonymous OCD sufferers would alter their speech in help forums after diagnosis. And my current students, Yixin Chen, she recently showed that when people disclose on Reddit some information, say, hi, I'm 43M and I want to know how to do help on a conference, that would actually gather more replies than if I just said, hi Reddit, I want more help at a conference. But the more of those identity signals that people would offer actually worked across purposes. If you just give age or gender, that seemed to be sufficient. You give age and gender and location, and all of a sudden the responses start decreasing as people stop seeing themselves as having a common or general experience and instead going back into very micro groups. And most recently, my student Sarah Ball just won the thesis prize at our department. Yay, Sarah! For showing how people's identities as they're displayed can come at a cost. She was looking at the cost of displaying one's gender within crowdsourced forums like Kickstarter, and whether that leads to discounting as people think that this person may be less competent because they're non-binary or because they're a woman. Interestingly, we were able to use non-binary people or images, I should say, because they were synthetic, and we literally tweaked parameters so that we took male image, female image, and blended them. And then we asked, what gender is this? And when people weren't sure, that's when we knew we got it right. So summary. Pseudonyms aren't exactly pseudonyms without the state. Pseudonym practices have been around for centuries or longer, both as folk social cohesion and as tools of resistance. Stigmatized groups can deploy pseudonyms as a means to avoid or push back against collapsed context. That's especially important for vulnerable persons. For queer persons coming out of a process of reconciliation to self and society. To mark oneself with queer labels to presuppose confidence in that label. Sometimes people don't know their label. They don't want to give that to everyone. But as soon as you take on a label, so you come out, you don't generally go back. We just assume that you were post coming out. Oh, you're straight now or something, I don't know. So the claim to universalism afforded by a name is a claim to the universalism of the dominion of the modern state. So this is only reasonable to the extent that the state can manage the needs of the public and that the public do not wield the power of stigmatization themselves. So where to next? And that's it. Research continues. Here's some other questions. I'll leave them for you. Just scan them up there. I don't want to read them because we're getting short on time. And finally, I'll leave with this claim: is a govern context for human activity rather than the humans themselves. And I'll leave that thought with you. How can we govern those contexts so that people can manage to get the information they want from the people they want, rather than for them to think of themselves as being the right kind of person for this space, thinking of the space as being the right kind of space for that person's needs. And I will leave that there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernie, for your brilliant presentation. It was very rich. And of course, you mentioned a lot of references, especially in terms of philosophical concepts. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions either in X or with Zoom.
Perhaps.
Probably I will take the first question on Zoom. So feel free to raise your hands.
I'll leave my slides up for now in case I want to reference them with screen share.
Yes, of course, it's better.
Online.
So you can raise your virtual hand, or you can either type in the chat window if you have questions.
Tashville. Ah, yeah. Oh, Tashville and Turner. Yes. Was there a question or just like my thoughts on?
It's just a very positive comment.
Yeah. Tashville and Turner, that shows up a lot. This is social identity theory in the sense that people draw from their the reference groups that they have. This work became very popular. That sort of work became very popular about 15 years ago when we started asking about things like the disinhibition hypothesis. Are people more likely to say things that are nasty or terrible online when they don't have identity features than when they do? Even that, I don't like that starting off. Just because what it's assuming is, it just assumes the worst of people, doesn't it? It says, if I don't know exactly who you are so that I can like run to the cops or run to mom and dad, then you're going to do something terrible. We're already presupposing that. And that's blinding us, I think, in many ways to the fact that organization happens without a sense of external recourse. It's framing the world as needing external recourse. I think that disempowers us. That's not to say that we shouldn't have external recourse. There's lots of times when we need it, and it should be there. But rather to set this up, it sounds very much, social identity vis-a-vis disinhibition, and then versus the social identity theories, has a bit too much for me of Hershey's social control hypothesis. This is the idea that without sort of the social control or a third party watching over you, you're just going to do terrible things. And I don't think that it just seems very untenable that humans would have got this far if that was our real nature. I just don't think it is. Oh, we have another question. Oh, we have English version.
I translated this into English. So are there any questions in X? Feel free to ask questions.
I promise I won't look up your pseudonyms if you ask. I've heard lots of these before. I can extemporize, but I'd love to hear any thoughts on this. This is admittedly, to give you a history of this, I wanted to write a book on this topic about 5-6 years ago, and I put in a book proposal, and I workshopped it for a few years, and I finally got accepted, so I have a book contract. But it's 4 years now, and in that 4 years, COVID happened. I had to do a lot of work for my own program and my students, and I published this lovely book right here, which is from social science to data science, which is kind of like the course notes for my course on Python, all the technical stuff that I've done. But I now have an opportunity to return to this book, and the world has kind of moved on a little bit, not really moved on, But we're in a different place right now where we're not just concerned about pseudonyms as in it's a name, but entirely whole identities. One example might be a Japanese cyclist who had used Snapchat-like lenses to convince people he had really nice hair. I mean, he had really nice hair. And so he used the face to convince people that he was like young 22-year-old lady, and that she was biking around Japan. And no one caught it until he told them that this is how good the technology is right now. I mean, the hair would be a real difficult problem, but and so I mean, yes, indeed, very lovely conditioned hair and everything. But the face was not his face, and the representation was not his representation. But this would be for me an example of one of these internal motivations, because he wanted people to care about his journey, and he wanted to do cycling, and he felt that he wouldn't be able to do this through other means. Now, whether this was appropriate or not, this is the sort of things that we need to address. But if we're to say, no, it's not appropriate for you to do that, then at what point in that gradient do we stop? Just before trans people? Just before drag queens? Just before gender play? Where do we stop in that? There becomes a point where it's very hard to determine the limits of what is permissible for one's identity as soon as we start projecting a normative basis of this. And this just happens online as well, where we assume now almost essentialist qualities to people about who should and shouldn't. Now, maybe that's okay. There's some things we probably shouldn't be doing. And we've culturally accepted some as inappropriate. We have drawn those lines for some things. For example, blackface. Just culturally, most people are establishing blackface as a problem. It's wrong, it's inappropriate, it mischaracterizes people, for example. But we don't yet, or maybe ever, feel the same way about drag. When is drag a mockery of femininity versus when is drag a celebration of femininity? These questions will have to be resolved in some way if we are to resolve the legitimacy of using and invoking such symbols and such likenesses. We're already seeing a reactionary movement against drag. For what it's worth, I watched the first 13 seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race. Haven't watched the last few. My opinions on this are ambivalent. But when I was told by a trans friend of mine, who she was early in her transition at that point, she was like, I don't like drag queens. I think of them as a mockery. I think that they're making it seem like it's clownish for someone born as a male to want to be female. And so that really took me back, because I thought that this was just a way for some people to express some things, but then actually those sorts of identities then reflect back on a variety of other people in ways that are potentially even unintended. So it's not as simple as saying everyone should be allowed to do everything all the time. We also know that there's great social harms that are being done by those who believe that they're not going to get caught. And that is also where we go with this. But how do we even have a language for this? A language that is not merely a paternalistic language of just like, oh, we just got to make sure everyone has their real name so that the state can protect us. When in fact, the state doesn't necessarily protect us and protect us at all times. And it doesn't necessarily act on information it has. A lot of crimes go unsolved and a lot of crimes go uncharged, even if they're real crimes. We cannot lean on this discourse even if we hope to. We must find other ways in order to manage social cohesion and these indiscretions from a cultural perspective, in my opinion.
Okay. Who will ask the next question?
We got a long one in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh. Study of multimedia and their religious or sexual orientation with pseudonyms or real person available. Can you consider studying their profile, even if they're engaging anonymously? I mean, can you take seriously into consideration their contribution to a dialogue, even if you're not sure who's behind the pseudonym? Yes. Cool. Oh, my gut is to say yes, you can take people seriously even if you don't know the, if you can't establish the provenance of that message, provenance being the origin of it. And in fact, sometimes I would say it's probably best for that provenance. There may be wisdom that one might have, which is difficult to provide otherwise. Now, there are ways to distinguish between way people are talking truthfully or not. The most reliable one is reliability. It's whether people are consistent in what they say across different phrases, whether they say this in depth. Interrogations are a well-known practice within policing, and there's no reason why those skills cannot be applied to more benevolent opportunities as well, rather than just trying to assume that it's a bad guy or something. But more than that, I think that there is a need to change the way we reflect upon our identities. And I'll be real brief on this one. This is before another talk in a few years, but it comes from that book, Presentation, Self, and Everyday Life. Irving Goffman said it's really, really hard for us. I'm paraphrasing. You can't find this quote on page 7, but it's around page 7. So, it's really, really hard to determine whether someone's performance is authentic. Am I an authentic Canadian? Am I an authentic Oxford professor? I'm kind of posh, isn't it, or something? But you know, I think a lot of people want to be authentic professors by dressing down a little bit. They're of the people or something. I like to think of this as a role that I perform. So, is that authentic? And Goffman's like, it's impossible, authentic versus fake, because that means you always are deferring to this third party for what's going to say whether it's right or wrong. He said, instead, we should look to whether people are being sincere or cynical in their self-presentation. It's not so much, am I an authentic me? It's, am I a sincere me? And that's an interesting shift for me. And the reason it's an interesting shift is because it shifts the evaluation from external to internal. Am I believing in my impression, or am I doing this as a means to an end? Am I saying something to you because I want something out of you, or am I saying something to you because it best reflects on me? Cynicism versus sincerity is for him, was much more germane way to look at how people understand the world and how they organize the world than authenticity versus fake. And I see that happening again, because we forgot that. He tried to tell people and get buried among the dramaturgical stuff or whatever, but we lost that. And so on the online spaces, we're again worrying about whether things are authentic or fake, rather than whether they are sincere or cynical. And it's the sincerity or the cynicism, which I believe now is what's most contested. When a major motion picture studio, Disney, replaces an actor of one origin with an actor of another origin, we now have people complaining, oh, that's not the authentic whatever. And they're kind of missing the point when it's that sort of authenticity challenge. Is it a sincere performance? Is this someone who wants to be that character? Is that imbued with that character? And sincerity can be perceived differently than authenticity. We say it doesn't matter if, you know, a certain character is played by a white actor or a black actor. Do they do a good job? And so the sincerity thus becomes a better yardstick than authenticity in that regard. We can't really tell what's, I mean, The Little Mermaid was a fairy tale, and a dark one at that. An authentic telling of The Little Mermaid probably wouldn't even make it onto TV right now. But a sincere telling of somebody who's yearning for something that they can't have can still happen with any variety of people from any variety of cultures. And so within this, sometimes I feel like, you know, we say authenticity in social media is becoming the norm. Because in real name spaces where authenticity is privileged, sometimes it's hard to be sincere. It's hard to have an opinion that is not the opinion shared by people of one's group. there is a party line for gay people right now. How do I feel about Drag Time Story Hour, which is taking over America, apparently? I feel it's a form of mutual antagonism, and I thought drag was funny when it was able to invoke gender sexuality in bars. Maybe that makes me old-timey, but at the same time, that opinion is a contestable one when I should be like, well, the right hates it, so therefore you should love it. And then I become a form of mutual antagonism because I generally identify left-wing, extremely crypto left. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if the question is clear. I don't know if the answer is clear, but I do want to make a pitch there within this for saying, how can we foster sincere self-presentations through pseudonyms rather than worry about authentic self-presentations without pseudonyms? That's where I'd land on that one.
Thank you, Amal, for your question. I would like to hear you more, Bernie, about Goffman's dramaturgical self, actually.
Sure.
And for instance, you mentioned, of course, what is involved in this conception.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know, in terms of, for instance, of characterization of an individual's ethos,
Mm-hmm.
the link between Goffman's conception and the way in which ethos is built for an individual, actually.
Oh, that's difficult. That's a fascinating question. Maybe I'll say it's back to the same thing I just said a minute ago. I think that it's drawn from whether there is an ideology of sincerity or authenticity at the basis of that presentation. Goffman's notion of impression management was meant in many ways to come up with a way to articulate people as acting in entirely reasonable ways in different circumstances. And an ethos is often considered as a kind of a pan-contextual way of approaching things. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it comes from the performances, but I think if people think of performances as authentic, knowing the pressures to speak to so many different people in different ways may really grind away at people. I'll also take maybe a bit of a punt on this one. I'll just give a lazy answer and defer to Early Hochschild. If Early Hochschild was a student of Goffman's, and she's got a number of really good books. A very, very good one from about 5 years ago about white working class people and how they felt dissatisfied. This may be leading to their attraction to right-wing politics, which is generally not in their economic interests, but which makes them feel good about their identity. But the book that I'm thinking of is called The Managed Heart. And this is a book where she describes the emotional labor, and that impression management is a form of emotional labor. It's often, not born equally in the population. Service workers tend to do a lot of emotional labor. Caring professions do a lot of emotional labor, and emotional labor is where you have to convey an emotion that's appropriate to the circumstance rather than to your internal state. So you just have to be nice to people when they're rude to you if you're like a flight attendant or on the phone with someone and you're a call center worker. And every time you're like, oh, that's really great, sir. Grinding your teeth and feeling that's work. And so if you think of your identity as being a kind of pan-contextual, the real me, every time that you have to do emotional labor, it must just crush you. Whereas if you think of you're playing this role and that you're just trying to do a good job at this role, you may be more able to manage the circumstance. Now, how that intervenes in the situations where your ethos is contested, I mean, I'll have to reflect on that.
Thank you.
Question maybe a problem to sort of get together. So it's about the idea of using pseudonym versus on the internet. And there's the risk for them to, I mean, it's a chance that we can change them. That is good. For instance, we can make lose contact with people. For instance, if we I follow artists on internet a lot, and sometimes they change their pseudonym. And if I don't follow them, well, I'm going to lose them completely, and it's very complicated to find them again. So this lack of continuity can also be a risk. Sometimes we can sever relationships. So it's not a question, it's more.
Yeah, but that's deliberate. And I think that's a good practice. I think the world is not just made of additions, but selections. And I bemoan the lack of an opportunity that young people have, and that I didn't have either, to just move to a new city. There is no new city anymore because your account is still your account on these cities. And this is an example of that, a form of recreation. You know, Robert Zimmerman moves to New York and becomes Bob Dylan, and he reinvents himself as Bob Dylan. And this process of reinvention for many people is important. And I believe that we should allow people the process of reinvention of themselves and permit that, and feel in the sort of weight of things generally that the agency to reinvent oneself is more important than the need for me to hold on to the old person. I suppose this comes to a head quite severely with trans people and dead names, and the notion of like a dead name and how does one escape or transcend, pun intended, transcend a dead name where it may chase someone around the web. I personally think that invoking someone's dead name is a form of transphobic abuse. I think it should be considered harassment in a legal sense. I think it's literally that severe in my impression. I feel that strongly about this issue. I feel because, again, we ask, to what extent do we have control over our own capacity to name ourselves? And pseudonyms give us a window into the way in which powerful actors want to stabilize the identity because they feel frustrated by people's interest in reinventing themselves or connecting with new people in different ways. That's good for people, but hard when you want to sell them goods, and hard when you want to sell people an identity in a data sense where it's like, well, this person likes Nike rather than Adidas. And all of a sudden they've got a new name. It's like, oh, you've got one less data point to sell to now. I don't think that is a sufficient reason to give people, if the governance by the state was bad, governance by the corporation is worse. It's even more cynical. So yeah, in those cases, I think we need to find a means to accept that sometimes it's just going to be hard to find people, and that, you know, we have to wish them well, and not feel that we have a claim to each other, except the claim that people want to give back to us. Those who want to know us can perhaps find us again. And if we both lose each other, then maybe it was fate, or maybe there was just not enough redundant social connections to begin with. And that's, I think, the price we pay for giving people the autonomy to navigate their own social worlds.
Thank you, Nino. Selim, you have a question.
Just very curious, but there's always a correlation between identity and pseudonym, because to be honest, I've always been guilty of using nicknames on the internet myself, but it was mostly for humor reasons. I like to play different characters just for fun. I love to use nicknames, but at the same time, I've always been open to my real life relationships. So my nickname, for example, my most popular nicknames are Evo is Ethan Packers and Oldie the Beast and David Jones. But it was mostly just for fun to play a role.
Sure.
But
It's like Lewis Carroll. You know, we still know who he was. He didn't publish this anonymously. He very much knew that he was publishing under Lewis Carroll, and he wanted a fun name, and there's some fun features of it. That is, we can have external motivations where we just maybe different personas, and the personas are an opportunity for play. They don't have to be serious about hiding things. Those are the internal motivations where we feel that we'll be stigmatized with our identity. But sometimes you just want a new identity. You want to be a rock star, you get a rock star name. Bernie Hogan. No, Buck Firestone. Or something. I don't know. It's more for a different kind of medium. But yeah, sure. I think it's entirely viable. And I think we should be able to foster that practice. Number one, it frustrates ever so slightly the ability for algorithms to give a totalizing, they know who you are everywhere. So it does give you a little bit of agency within that, but it also signals to people how you want to position yourself to them. When I use Bernard J. Hogan, we're talking about finances or law. When we're talking about Bernie Hogan, we're talking about academic work. When we're talking about Bernard Hogan Richards, we're actually referring to the the legal hyphenated name of me and my husband. And I'm not shy about those. I feel that those are contextually appropriate. And yeah, I too feel that is the case, that pseudonyms are always a part of that. And they should always be a part of it, because that means that there's always a means by which our identity is not just imposed by others, that we're taking it back for ourselves. Yeah.
To me, they are kind of like a way to explore new ideas and perspectives. For example, when I become bold, I become a different person. It's just a lot of fun.
And so that to me is the tension between authenticity and sincerity. Because if we focus on authenticity, then we may consider that practice to be problematic. How dare you do that? You should be known by your name. Are you messing with people with these other names? But if we think of it in terms of sincerity, this is allowing you to adopt a persona, to play with it, to play with a personality, to think, do you like this? Is it fun? Which people do on stage all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Selim.
I'm not sure how time is going. I don't want to keep people too long.
Yeah. Have you got any questions?
Well, thank you all for your feedback so far, and for your own opinions, your feedback. I do appreciate this. For those of you who are on the call, who haven't turned on your camera, I do appreciate you tuning in. Sometimes I just want to have this on the background as well. You're also a welcome member of this audience to me. And if you have any other feedback or ideas, my inbox is always open. And in fact, I'd just Google me. I guess it's sort of weird to say that now, but it's been years for which, there's not that many Bernie Hogans out there. There's like 2 more. There's one in Ireland, and I sometimes get her mail for her drapery business. They send the invoices to me instead, because she's like Bernie.Hogan6@gmail. And I'm just like Bernie Hogan, so people forget the 6 and then they just send it to me, and I often have to be like, yeah. But and then there's one other Bernie Hogan who did some work in technology many moons ago, but he's not. So yeah, that is its own, for me, that's become its own challenge, where you probably wouldn't have the audacity to other people to say, yeah, just Google, you'll find it. But that did happen to me, and it is the case now. And so I too have to reconcile with that. Oh, could I email you a summary? Well, I had mentioned that I hadn't put references in this presentation, at least a bibliography at the end, and I can provide a bibliography. But most of this presentation can be found in between, except for the stuff on the state and governing, most of it can be found between 2 articles. One is, I can't remember the name of these now. The Pseudonyms and the Rise of the Real Name Web, in the Blackwell Companion to New Media Dynamics. Pseudonyms and the Rise of the Real Name Web. Oh, I'm not even typing in a chat window. And the other one is, I I can't remember the name of the full name of the piece, but it's my most cited. So it's if you go to Google Scholar and sort by most cited, it's the that'll get you there. It's like identity in the age of social media, presentation of self in the age of social media, distinguishing performances and exhibitions online. That was a good one. That was lightning in a bottle. That presentation. Interestingly, while you're asking, I want to actually give a plug for a piece of mine that you can find online that nobody cites, but what I really like, and I wish more people would. And that's called breakups and the limits of encoding love. And in that piece, which is for a book on relationships by Zizi Papakarisi, I extend these two pieces that I'm discussing here to talk about relations as processes rather than objects, and love as an example of a process. And so when we break up, we take an object or a marked object, a data object, you and you are in a relationship, and you say like, all right, we're through. As soon as you say we're through, it's not like there's a little AI that goes, now I will go around the web and scrub everything about your relationships together. No, you have to do that. You have to go online and tell people that you broke up. You have to go and clear out those photos. Those are objects that kind of you're beholden to about your relationships. And I like thinking about the breakup, not because I like thinking about breakups, they're sad, but I like thinking about it because it's an opportunity for us to reveal how the logic of connectivity and the logic of sharing online is very pervasive, but not necessarily healthy. That it doesn't always work for us. That sometimes we can, suffer from this disconnect and this assumption. First, the assumption that more connectivity is better. We should always be connected, and that we can take processes, unfolding relations as time goes on, and just call them a thing, a yes or a no, in or out, boyfriend, not boyfriend. I mean, the people who've actually found the article seem to find it really, really pleasant. But I mean, I don't, not a lot of people see that. And as for the rest of it, you'll have to wait for a couple of years, because the long version of this is going to be in a book called, ostensibly, we'll see if it's going to be called this, Me, Myself, and ID. Encoding identities from real names to deep fakes. And hopefully that book will actually get written. And this talk was part of a opportunity, along with the prior seminar that I did, and I want to thank you for that as well, to have these sort of anchor points. Nothing moves like a deadline, right? So by having a deadline to kind of take that pseudonym stuff that I did and kind of shove it through concerns about platforms and state actors and governance, and throwing in mummers, because I'm just totally enchanted by that. This was that opportunity. And so hopefully that will be chapter 3 of that book sometime next year. Until then, it's you got to hear this in its very protean state, very early state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I should conclude today's session. First of all, of course, I would like to thank Bernie for his talk today. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank the audience, either on site or online. The next session of the seminar will deal with conflictual discourses on Wikipedia. So conflict on Wikipedia. I will welcome in Aix-en-Provence on the 20th of March, Dr. Céline Pouda from Université Côte d'Azur. She will talk on the following topic: comment caractériser les discussions conflictuelles en ligne, de la constitution du corpus à l'exploration des observables. This session will happen on the 20th of March from 4:30 to 6:30 French time, and it will also be a hybrid session, so you will have the possibility to follow it with Zoom as well. Thank you so much to everyone, and see you soon. Thank you.